Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to talk about something huge, invisible labor. You know, it's all the work that holds our world together, but so often it just goes completely unseen. And to get into it, we're going to start with a scene that I think so many of us are going to recognize immediately. Wow. I mean, that line just perfectly captures a feeling, doesn't it? It's that constant, relentless motion that happens right at the edges of a party. You can almost feel that rhythm of carrying, clearing, caring. It's just the perfect setup for everything we're about to dive into.
Okay, so let's get into our first section, the fire she tends. And we're starting right here for a really good reason. This phrase grounds us in a very specific and for a lot of people, a very, very familiar place, the big holiday dinner.
Yeah, this slide totally nails what our source calls the holiday double shift. For some people, a holiday means rest, connection, and family time. But for the person who's tending that fire, it is often the exact opposite. The tasks just multiply, the smile has to stay on, and the work goes on long after everyone else has gone to bed. And then you've got this layer of pressure. This isn't just work, it's work that's constantly being judged against some impossible inherited standard. And you know the toughest part? The judgment usually comes so casually from the very people being served, who probably have no idea how much effort just went into that meal. And this, right here, brings us to the core idea: invisible labor. It's like the engine running in the background of your life. It's so deeply expected that you don't even notice it's there, until it stops. Or, until it falls just a little bit short of that unspoken standard. So if this all feels so familiar today, you have to ask, where did it come from? Well, to really understand what's happening now, we have to look back, because this is not a new thing at all. It has incredibly deep roots in history. I mean, just think about this for a second. For centuries, women's unpaid labor wasn't just part of the household economy, it was the household economy. And the sheer scope of what that meant, well, it's pretty staggering, as you're about to see. This slide does such a great job showing the sheer volume of it. And this goes way, way beyond cooking and cleaning. We're talking about harvesting rye, preserving all the food for the winter, making cheese, tending to the animals, weaving cloth, making pottery, and then, on top of all of that, providing all the care for the kids, the elderly, and anyone who got sick. It's just a breathtaking amount of work. And here it is. This is the absolute heart of the issue, taken right from our source material. All of that work, all of that real, tangible economic value was provided entirely without a salary. It was just expected. Okay, so how did this historical expectation end up shaping the world outside the home? Well, that assumption that her labor is just a given, it didn't stay behind closed doors. It got baked into the very systems and structures of our modern world. I mean, just look at this timeline. It wasn't until 1929 that women were legally considered persons in Canada. That's not ancient history. My grandmother was alive then. And when you put that date right next to today's persistent wage gap and wealth gap and leadership gap, you start to realize just how recent the starting line for equality really is. This is just such a powerful real-world example from the poem. It shows how a world that was designed without women's bodies in mind isn't just an inconvenience, it can be downright dangerous. The assumption was that the default human was a man, and that has had literal life-or-death consequences. The crash dummy is such a stark example, but this problem goes so much deeper. For decades, car safety was designed for male bodies. So much medical research just excluded female subjects entirely. And as this slide points out, even today, women's heart attack symptoms can be dangerously written off as just anxiety. It all comes from the same flawed starting point, that the male experience is the default human experience. So we've looked at the physical work and the systemic problems, but that's only part of the story, right? What about the costs you can't see? The quiet, emotional, and psychological burdens that are carried alongside everything else? I love this question so much. What is the work besides the work? Because the labor isn't just about the tasks themselves. No, it's about everything else you have to carry while you're doing them. That work besides the work, it's the constant management of risk and perception. It's navigating the daily friction of a world that's still shaped by sexism. And in some of the most heartbreaking cases, it is the performance of silence, the heavy, heavy labor of hiding abuse just to protect a family or keep your children safe. That kind of work, by its very nature, has to be invisible.
And what's so critical to understand here is the relentless expectation. This work gets done through migraines, through illness, through absolute exhaustion. There are no sick days from this role. The dinner still has to get on the table. The kids still need to be taken care of. The performance is demanded no matter what your body is going through.
So, after centuries of expectation, after lifetimes of carrying this invisible load, what happens? What happens when the person who's been tending the fire just stops? Now remember the context here. This isn't just about one person making a choice. It's a choice that's pushing back against the weight of generations of expectation. The work was always just assumed. The standard was always inherited. And then you get this line from the poem, and it lands with such quiet power. It's not some loud protest. It's not a big announcement. It's a simple, radical act of self-preservation. She just stopped. She decided not to light a fire that wouldn't warm her. And the reaction? Oh, the reaction says everything. It's not really anger, it's just pure confusion, shock. Her labor was so foundational, so completely taken for granted, that for it to just be gone, it felt like a law of nature, like gravity had suddenly been broken. And this is the beautiful, profound truth that gets revealed in that moment. The world doesn't end. The house doesn't fall down. The big catastrophe everyone implicitly feared just doesn't happen. The only thing that actually breaks is the unspoken, untrue assumption that she wasn't entitled to rest in the first place. So, after all of this, the history, the systems, the personal cost, it all really comes down to one final, provocative question. And so we end here. This isn't just a call for a day off. It's a call for a fundamental transfer of the mental load. It asks us to imagine a world where the person who has always woken up wondering what must be done simply doesn't. What if someone else had to be the one to wake up and wonder?
Imagine, working a really grueling 16-hour shift. You're managing this highly complex agricultural supply chain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you oversee production, quality control, food preservation, personnel, all of it.
Right, a massive job.
But now imagine being told that your compensation for this staggering amount of labor is exactly zero.
Zero pay. Just wow.
Nothing.
Yeah.
And furthermore, you don't even legally own the estate you're maintaining. And there are no sick days.
Yeah, that sounds impossible today. But, I mean, that was the daily reality for women in rural historical Aragon.
Exactly. And according to the stack of sources we're diving into today, the invisible architecture of that unpaid labor didn't just, disappear with modern technology.
No, it really didn't.
It just evolved. And it might actually be dictating who washes the dishes at your family gatherings right now.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring the invisible, uncounted engine that keeps society running women's unpaid labor.
It's a massive topic. I mean, we're looking at labor that functions as the absolute foundation of the global economy, right?
Yeah.
But it rarely makes it into formal historical textbooks. It's the background machinery making all the foreground events possible.
For sure. And our sources for this deep dive give us this really multi-layered look at that machinery. We have a highly detailed historical transcript documenting rural village life in Aragon, Spain.
Which is fascinating on its own.
It really is. And then we also have a modern analytical article. It's titled "The Fire She Still Lights," alongside a pretty striking poem called "The Fire She Never Sat Beside."
Yeah, and reading those together rather than just in isolation, it reveals this really stubborn through line.
It's uncanny, honestly.
Yeah.
If you hold up the life of a historical woman harvesting rye and compare it against a modern woman managing a corporate job and a family holiday, the reflection is just staggering.
Right, because the setting changes, obviously.
Mhm.
But the fundamental dynamic remains entirely intact.
Yeah.
The modern article makes a very strong case that the expectation of continuous, unpaid, and, largely unacknowledged labor never actually went away. It was adapted to a digitized world. Okay, let's unpack this. Because how can we even begin to accurately compare a historical farm worker living off the land with a modern professional navigating the 21st century? On the surface, those look like two totally different universes.
What's fascinating here is the concept of a baseline. To understand the modern arguments about invisible labor, you really first have to look at the historical baseline detailed in that Aragonese transcript.
Right, the daily reality.
Exactly. The specific physical tasks have changed, from spinning thread to answering after-hours emails, but the core assumption of absolute availability is identical.
Yeah, the text notes that the woman in these rural villages was the very first person to rise. literally to light the central fire, and the absolute last to sleep.
Every single day.
And the transcript gives us this incredibly granular look at what dawn to dusk actually required. The sheer volume of chores is just staggering. But the sources don't just list them, they explain how they worked. Like, let's look at the rye harvest in these mountain villages.
Right, the harvesting mechanics.
Yeah, the text explains that the men, the reapers, would go through and cut the grain with scythes. But the women were right there behind them, stacking the bundles. And then came the winnowing.
Winnowing is a perfect example of this. It's high-endurance, repetitive labor that was economically vital, but it was categorized simply as domestic duty.
Right. The text details how they would manually toss the heavy grain into the air, just letting the wind blow away the dust and the chaff.
Which is physically exhausting.
Yeah, while the heavy grain fell onto a winnowing sheet. And the mechanism of this work didn't end there either. They had to pass it all through a sieve to remove the defective ears, gather the clean grain into heavy sacks, and haul it to the granary.
Oh, and don't forget the straw.
Yes, they took the leftover elastic rye straw and actually wove it into rings to hold hot copper cauldrons, just so the hearth wouldn't get stained with soot.
Notice how the labor seamlessly crosses over there. From heavy agricultural processing directly into home maintenance and tool creation, there's just no boundary.
Not at all.
The economic output of the farm and the maintenance of the household were deeply, deeply fused.
And the food preservation was on a whole other level. The transcript describes them drying whole peeled peaches on reed mats, meticulously cutting them into strips.
Right?
They reserved sections of those mats to dry tomatoes, using this specific mechanism of just a handful of salt to draw out the moisture.
It's basically applied chemistry.
Yeah. And in a town called Fraga, the men would be up on ladders harvesting figs, while the women and children were down below gathering them and transporting them to the drying areas.
We really have to remember that this preservation work wasn't like a hobby. It was the mechanics of survival.
Right, they had to eat.
Exactly. They were processing that food specifically to alleviate the inevitable production shortages during the harsh winter months.
Which is brutal.
The authors of the transcript make it very clear if that specific, highly skilled preservation work didn't happen, the family simply did not survive the winter.
Wow. And I really want to talk about the saffron rose harvest because that detail really stood out to me.
Oh, the saffron, yeah.
The sources describe the women separating the stigmas from the flowers completely by hand. But they had to do it at first light.
Right, because of the sun.
Yeah, the text explains that these roses sprouted overnight, and if the sun hit them for too long, they totally lost their value.
It's such a tight deadline.
And then, fast forward to December, and it was the olive harvest. They were either pole beating the trees or hand-picking the olives, literally sliding their closed hands over every single rough branch in the freezing cold.
Just punishing physical labor.
Yeah. And then they were milking ewes, straining the milk through fine cloths to make cheese. They were doing manual thread works like bobbin lace.
Which the source has a great phrase for, right?
Yeah, it calls it a white magic of filigree. They used pins and bobbins on a cardboard pattern. It required immense precision and took a huge toll on their eyesight.
When we look at the mechanics of all those tasks, I mean, the speed required for the saffron, the physical toll of the olive branches, the eye strain of the lace, the sheer physical and mental endurance required is just massive.
Totally. I kept thinking as I read this, if you translated this role into modern corporate terms, this woman is operating as a chief operating officer.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, she's managing complex supply chains, managing personnel, overseeing production, quality control, and long-term strategic planning for the winter starvation months.
It's a COO role, for sure, but while that COO analogy works on a managerial level, it actually falls short in one really crucial way.
How so?
A modern COO can quit, and a COO gets equity. The text explicitly notes that this woman held no title, drew zero salary, and critically had no legal right to own the estate she was maintaining.
Wait, if the women were doing all of the harvesting coordination, the winnowing, the food preservation, the cheese making, the tool creation, what exactly were the men doing during the winter months when the main harvest was over?
Well, that's the thing.
Because it sounds like the women were basically running the entire economy.
That is the core economic tension the historical source highlights. The men's labor was largely categorized as primary agricultural production-like, the initial plowing and cutting.
Okay.
But the women's labor, which involved turning that raw material into actual survival goods, was categorized merely as household duties. The global economy of the era functioned specifically because this massive continuous sector of labor was entirely uncompensated.
And that dynamic bleeds right into a specific line in the Aragonese transcript that serves as a really good bridge to our modern sources.
The holidays.
Yeah. The text notes that on holidays, women were the only family members who never stopped working. In fact, their tasks actually increased to entertain the guests.
The holiday paradox.
Exactly.
A day of rest and celebration for the broader family translates mechanically into a day of doubled labor for the person managing the household.
And that historical reality hasn't vanished just because we have modern appliances. It just moved into the modern kitchen, which is perfectly captured in the poem and the article we're looking at today.
So true.
The sources describe a scene that so many of you listening will probably recognize. A mother disappearing into the kitchen at Christmas.
The poem uses this really vivid imagery. She is carrying the heavy ham in, she is carrying the bones out, she's putting the children to bed, fetching forgotten scarves for guests, and washing dishes in the steam of the sink while the men sit back in the living room, pour whiskey, and laugh.
It's such a stark contrast. The authors argue that this represents a profound isolation disguised as a celebration.
Right.
The labor is intensely physical, but it's also deeply emotional and managerial. She is coordinating the event, managing the children's moods, and ensuring everyone else's comfort, entirely at the expense of her own participation in the holiday.
Here's where I want to push back on the societal reaction to this, though. Because the modern article points out how often this massive amount of effort, this exhausting double shift, is met with casual judgment instead of gratitude.
Oh, the comments.
Yes. The source highlights this devastating quote, often heard at these gatherings, well, it's not as good as Grandma used to make.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Why is that the default response? Why judgment?
The article digs into the psychology behind that critique, actually. The work is entirely invisible until it falls short of an inherited expectation.
Inherited from who?
From previous generations. The standard of the perfect holiday, the perfect meal, is inherited from previous generations of women who also exhausted themselves behind the scenes.
Ah, I see.
Because the work is expected as a baseline assumption, it isn't seen as a gift or a favor. And so the woman performing it is measured against both the inheritance of the past and the invisible expectation of the present.
That's incredibly heavy.
It is. When labor is a presumed law of nature, people don't offer gratitude. They offer performance reviews.
Wow. Performance reviews. Which leads to the breaking point described in the sources.
Yeah, the poem.
Right. The poem frames this moment as a quiet refusal. One year, this mother simply stopped. There was no loud announcement, no dramatic protest. As the poem says, she just did not light what would not warm her.
I love that line.
It's powerful. She just sat down while the holiday happened around her.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the authors emphasize that her stopping didn't, dismantle the global economy. It didn't rewrite patriarchal history, but it fundamentally changed her kitchen.
Yeah.
And the mechanism of that change is fascinating. It exposed the invisible labor purely through its sudden absence. When the fire stayed cold and the dishes piled up, everyone looked around as if a law of physics had been broken.
But as the modern article points out, while you can refuse to cook a holiday ham, you cannot simply opt out of the larger structural imbalances built into modern society. The kitchen was just a microcosm of the whole system.
Exactly. The expectation of invisible labor extends into the very architecture of our economic and legal systems.
Right.
The sources pivot from the domestic space to the structural space here, outlining how the world was designed around a very specific default.
And the sources lay out these modern structural inequalities so clearly. They note that women earn less, own less property globally, and are deeply underrepresented in leadership. And the article brings up a concept I want to make sure we clearly understand. It states that unpaid domestic and care work remains entirely uncounted in formal economic metrics like
Right.
GDP. I mean, I understand the basic premise, but how exactly does that mechanism work? Why isn't running a household considered part of the economy?
It comes down to how gross domestic product is calculated. GDP only measures goods and services that are bought and sold in formal markets.
Okay.
So if you hire a professional chef to cook dinner, money changes hands and the GDP goes up. The economy has supposedly grown.
Right.
But if you buy the exact same ingredients and cook the exact same meal for your family, no money changes hands for the labor, so the GDP registers as zero.
So the labor is identical, the value created is identical, but the economic metric is completely blind to it simply because it wasn't monetized.
Precisely. The article argues that because our primary measure of economic health ignores unpaid care work, Policymakers and institutions design laws and budgets as if that labor requires zero support or infrastructure.
That's wild. And the historical context for this institutional blindness is even wilder. The article points out that in Canada, women were not legally recognized as persons under the law until 1929.
1929.
The authors emphasize that this is not ancient history. This is literally within the last century.
When you realize that the legal definition of a person defaulted to male for the formative centuries of modern institution building, it explains a lot about the physical world we inhabit.
So what does this all mean for the physical reality we walk around in today? Because the article argues this lack of historical personhood literally physically shaped the world.
It's shaped in ways that the authors note can be fatal, actually.
Fatal.
Take automotive safety. The article explains that car safety systems, seat belts, and crash test dummies were originally designed and calibrated entirely around the measurements, weight distribution, and muscle mass of the average male body. Yeah, they did not factor in female bone density or a different center of gravity. The mechanism of that bias meant that for decades, safety systems designed to save lives were inadvertently leaving women much more vulnerable to severe injury in a collision.
Just because the engineering default was male.
Exactly.
And the text points out that this default extends directly into the medical world, too.
Oh, heavily.
The sources highlight that medical research historically excluded women from early-stage clinical trials. And because of that structural exclusion, the symptoms of life-threatening conditions were established based on how they presented in men.
Right, which causes huge issues today.
Yeah, the article specifically mentions the mechanism of a heart attack. A woman's heart attack can still be misdiagnosed in emergency rooms as anxiety because her symptoms, which might be nausea or back pain, don't match the classic chest-clutching male symptoms that the foundational textbooks were based on.
The physical infrastructure, the medical knowledge base, the economic systems, they all carry the inherited biases of a time when women were not considered full participants in the public sphere.
And yet, despite the system not being built for them, women are still expected to carry that invisible labor, and to do it while working through immense physical pain.
Always.
The article brings up the expectation of continuity. Women are expected to continue this unpaid labor through pregnancy, through severe menstrual pain, and through debilitating neurological disorders like migraines.
Yeah, the authors emphasize that a migraine isn't just a headache, it's a systemic neurological event, and it disproportionately affects women.
But there are no sick days from the role of a caregiver.
None. The article draws a direct line back to our historical transcript here. Whether it is an Aragonese woman gathering figs in the freezing cold, or a modern woman managing a household while deeply unwell, the expectation is continuity. The work must happen regardless of what the body performing is enduring.
Right. The guests are arriving anyway. The children still need to be fed. And the expectation isn't just that the work gets done, but that it gets done effortlessly.
Yes.
The poem specifically critiques the societal demand that women avoid any performance of exhaustion. You aren't just supposed to do the work. You're supposed to look happy doing it.
Which brings us to the final layer the sources explore. Because beyond the physical exhaustion of the chores and the structural disadvantages of the economy, there is a psychological toll that statistics and GDP fail entirely to capture.
Yeah, the sources refer to this as the unseen psychological labor of navigating environments shaped by sexism. And they break down the mechanisms of this mental drain.
It's exhausting just reading about it.
It's the daily friction of having your competence questioned in an office meeting. It's having your authority systematically undermined. It's the mental gymnastics required when demeaning comments are casually dismissed as jokes.
Right. The article argues that in those moments, a woman has to decide, in a split second, whether to laugh it off or risk being labeled as difficult or humorless.
Exactly.
The authors frame that as an ambient calculation. It is a constant low-grade hum of managing risk, managing perception, and managing the egos of those around you.
And it requires a massive amount of cognitive and emotional bandwidth that is, of course, never accounted for in a job description.
Never.
And the sources go to a very solemn, very real place regarding this hidden labor. They discuss the most invisible management of all living with domestic abuse.
Yeah. This raises an important question. Why does the management of abuse stay so deeply hidden?
What do the texts say?
They explain that it remained hidden not because it is rare, but because of the immense societal pressure placed on women to maintain the facade of stability.
To keep the peace.
Right. The authors argue that women often carry the burden of protecting their children from the fallout, avoiding public stigma, and preventing family shame. The labor of maintaining the illusion of a functional family often falls squarely on the person suffering the most within it.
It creates this devastating, compounded invisibility. The article synthesizes this perfectly. Not only is the daily physical work of caregiving and household management unseen and unpaid, but the incredible physical, emotional, and social cost of performing that work is completely erased from the narrative.
It's totally erased.
The management of silence is its own full-time, uncompensated job.
When policymakers talk about unpaid labor, they usually speak in terms of tasks and hours. They list the chores. But the fuller truth presented by these sources is that this labor is performed under a heavy canopy of societal expectation, relentless scrutiny, and deep emotional strain.
Bringing it full circle back to that haunting poem, the metaphor of the fire is just so resonant. The authors remind us that the fire doesn't just burn on its own.
It never has.
Someone is always asked to tend it, in every century, in every country, in every room where the guests never wash their own plates. Whether you're sweeping a hearth in rural Aragon or carrying a mental list of who needs what at a modern family reunion, someone is keeping the fire burning, even when it hurts.
The continuity of that fire represents the continuity of human survival and comfort. But as the text argues, it has historically relied on the silent sacrifice of the person tending it.
So for you listening right now, I really want you to consider the fires being tended in your own life. Look around your home, look around your workplace. Who is doing the invisible labor? Who's managing the mental lists?
Yeah.
Who is anticipating needs and smoothing over the rough edges of the day so that everyone else can just exist comfortably? Notice it. Acknowledge the mechanism of that effort.
And as you think about that, the sources leave us with a fascinating thought experiment to mull over.
Oh, I love this part.
We have established that the very architecture of our global economy relies on the foundational assumption that women's care and domestic labor will always be provided endlessly and for free.
Right.
If domestic labor was suddenly billed at market rate tomorrow morning, which global economy would collapse first? What would actually happen to our financial systems if every single hour of that invisible work suddenly came with a literal invoice?
That is a staggering thought to leave on. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible structures around you. Keep looking for the people tending the fires, and we will see you next time.